Well, hello there. This is Joe Van Cleve, and today we're going to talk about making Holga Direct Positive Selfies. Okay, so what is that? Well, if you've seen some of my previous videos, you know that I like to use the Harman Direct Positive Paper, and I like to shoot it in a variety of different kinds of medium and large format cameras. Well, today we're going to take a real simple basic camera, a plastic toy 35mm Holga camera, and we're going to use this to make selfies with. So you know selfies are the big thing in photography these days, especially with mobile phone photography. Everybody has a phone on them, they hold their phone up and they take selfies. Well, we're going to do something a little bit different. So when you get a camera like a Holga, when you open up the camera in the back, you're going to see that it has a film gate that's designed for 35mm size film. And normally you would have a roll of film threaded up in here. Well, instead of threading up a roll of film in the camera, we're going to cut little rectangles of direct positive paper that are going to fit into this film gate. I do this in my darkroom. If you're clever about it, you can, and you don't have a darkroom, you can actually use a changing bag, and if you can figure out how to measure it just by feel, like with a little cardboard template, you can use scissors and cut the paper out yourself that way. When you load the paper into the camera, if you try balancing the film or the slip of paper on the film gate and then closing the camera, you might find that it slips real easy. There is a pressure plate on the camera, but it doesn't really provide you with a whole lot of pressure. So what I've done is I make a little loop of masking tape, like painter's masking tape. And then I can set the little paper rectangle of Harman Direct Positive Paper on that with the emulsion side up. It'll stick to that, and then when I close the camera down, it holds it in place and it doesn't slip. So how big of a piece of paper are you going to need? Well, the actual image area on a 35mm camera is 24mm tall by 36mm wide. But the actual film itself from edge to edge is 35mm wide. So I'll cut a piece of paper that's about 35mm wide and about 1.5 inches or so long. You stick it on your film gate, close it down, and you're ready to make your exposure. Okay, let's talk about exposing Harman Direct Positive Paper. Well, first of all, I like to rate the film speed of Harman Direct Positive Paper at around somewhere between 1.5 and 3, depending on the quality of light. If it's really high contrast light, like daylight, I'll usually rate it at about 3 so that I don't overexpose the highlights too badly. If it's indirect light, which is really where I prefer to shoot at, I'll rate Harman Direct Positive Paper more about 1.5 or 2. The way I meter for Harman Direct Positive Paper, or most of my photography involving paper negatives or whatever, is I have an old light meter that has served me well over the years, and this is a Gossen Luna Pro F. And I will set the film speed here on the dial, and in this case, this morning I was doing a series of Harman Direct Positive selfies in the Holga. I set the film speed to 1.6 on my meter. We're going to be shooting it under indirect light, and I use the direct reflected metering mode. I don't use the incident with the dome. So what I do is I point the camera at the subject, like if it was me, I would be pointing it at myself. I would zero the needle and read off the exposure time opposite the f-stop of the lens of the camera. So that gets to the point of what's the f-stop of the lens of a Holga 35mm film camera? Well, you can read through various sources on the internet, but basically the Holga has one true aperture of f8, and I don't know if you can't see that, there's a little aperture, f8, and then if you slide the little exposure lever over to daylight, it puts a little plastic small window in front of the aperture and cuts down the amount of light and kind of vignettes the lens for f11, but we're going to use it at f8. So f8 is the cloudy setting on the Holga. The other thing is, what about shutter speed? Well, because the instantaneous shutter on the Holga is only about 1/100th of a second or 125th of a second, and if you use Harman Direct Positive Paper or even paper negatives in the camera, you're going to need an exposure time much longer than 125th of a second, even in bright sunlight. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use the bulb setting. So on the bottom of the Holga there is a switch between normal, which is N, and B, which is bulb. And the bulb setting is the shutter stays open for as long as the button is pressed. So you might be able to see through the back of the camera. So when I press the shutter right here, you can see the little light. As long as the shutter's pressed, the button is pressed, the shutter's open. So we're going to use the bulb setting. We're going to use it on the cloudy setting, which is f8, wide open aperture for this particular camera. And under the conditions that I shot this morning's pictures at, which was some of them in my front porch under cloudy skies, some of them in my back porch, which is covered facing north, so I have this north indirect light, which I really love. I was getting exposure times on the order of between 1 and 2 seconds. So, this brings to mind the third element of using these Holga cameras, which is focus. So you might know on a Holga camera you're going to have these various focus symbols on the lens. And it goes from one person to 3 people to a group of people to mountains. And what these actually correspond to is 3 feet, 6 feet, 18 feet, and 30 feet and beyond. And I have that actually written on a Sharpie marker on the lens. So if you focus all the way to the single person mode, that's about 3 feet. Now your arm, most people's arm is a little bit less than 3 feet long, so it's a little hard to push the shutter button and take a selfie, right? So what I'm going to use is I'm going to use a shutter release cable, a long one. I happen to have this shutter release cable that I use with a large format camera. This one is like, 3 feet long at least. And the Holga camera, the shutter button does have a threaded port to receive a shutter release cable. So now I can have my camera on the tripod, and I can have this shutter release cable off to the side of the image with my hand, and I can take my picture without it being seen in the picture. So that's how I'm going to do my selfie. When you line up the camera on the tripod, you're going to want to, of course, get it level, get it centered, and then if you want your eyes to be not in the middle of the picture but slightly toward the top of your head is near the top of the frame, you're going to want to tilt the camera slightly down like that so your eyes are more at the top of the picture. And you'll get a sense of how that works when you start making these test exposures. So let's talk about how do I process these pictures. I've loaded the Harman paper, I've cut it down to size, loaded it in the camera, put it on a tripod, put my shutter release cable, set up under north-facing indirect light, get it framed up, sit in front of it, smile or grimace or however you want to pose, stay real steady for 2 seconds, hit the exposure. Now what do? Well, if you have a full-blown darkroom, you can simply set up some little trays and process these little negatives or little positive prints in chemistry. But what's more convenient is I use a 35mm stainless developing tank. This is the kind that has the 2 reels for 35mm film. What I do is I leave the 2 reels in the tank, and the little rectangles of paper, I'm going to slip them into the tank between the tank and the outside of the reel with the emulsion side facing to the inside. And you'll be able to put like at least 4 of them in here so they won't interfere with each other. And then you put the lid on tightly. Then what you're going to do is you're only going to need about 80 milliliters of chemistry. And you're going to be rotating the developing bottle sideways, like that. And the chemistry is just going to fill up in the bottom of the tank, and as you rotate it, just like a rotary developing base, the paper will be immersed repeatedly and taken out of the chemistry repeatedly as you slowly rotate it, and it'll develop very evenly. So I have a more detailed video of how I develop small-sized Harman Direct Positive prints in my kitchen with a developing tank. But just as a shortcut, brief description, I use a paper developer such as Ilford's Universal Liquid Paper Developer, something like that. I'm usually diluting it 5.5 milliliters of liquid concentrated developer into about 80 milliliters of water. Then I'll use a small quantity, 80 milliliters of water as a rinse, 80 milliliters of stop bath, another 80 milliliters of water, and then an 80 milliliters of fixer for 2 minutes, and then a couple little rinses. So that all of this takes on the order of less than 10 minutes, maybe 8 minutes. You can go from exposing your pictures to having wet prints ready to go. So I've already done some of these this morning, and let me turn around off camera here. I have a little beaker where these little prints are sitting, and I'm going to just pull out one of these. They're still wet, of course, and but here is a little selfie, a little Joe selfie, and I'm going to go show you the close-up of this. But this is how they come out. They work very nicely. It's tiny. You can put them in tiny little frames. If you go to these Mexican import shops, which are very popular here in the Southwest, you can find these little Mexican-made sheet metal decorative little kind of diorama boxes. You know, they have little glass front and little tiny box where you might put a little shrine in or something, or the Virgin. But anyways, these kind of work really cool in those. You can put your little selfie in there, and then you can worship yourself. Now, but there he is, Harman Direct Positive Selfies. And if you get to the point of getting really good at making these, there's the possibility that you might start doing portraits of people, right? So that'll be kind of fun. Okay, well, have fun with your Harman Direct Positive Holga Selfies. Have a good day.